Anyway, let me talk a bit about the News Media Bargaining Code, what it is, why it's there, what it achieved, and then I'm happy to briefly answer some questions. So it's important, firstly, to understand that the News Media Bargaining Code was recommended by the ACCC, which is the equivalent of your Competition Commission of India. But we were asked by government to do a review of digital platforms, news, advertising, and other things. So when the government asks us to do that, that unlocks our ability to gather information compulsorily from companies. But most important, they're asking for recommendations from us. So this wasn't a ruling by the ACCC, this was a recommendation to government, and then government adopted what we recommended. So we weren't using our powers. This was government legislation, not competition law. We started the study that the government asked us to do in late 2017. We reported in mid-2019, and by the end of 2019, the government had largely accepted, well, virtually all of our recommendations. We had a number of recommendations relating to media. We recommended the government fund regional and rural media that was a bit under threat, and they did that. We asked them to keep funding, because one of the major ways government supports media in Australia is by funding the Australian Broadcasting Commission, as well as the Special Broadcasting Service, and that is being done. And we also talked about tax exemption status for people donating to media, and that wasn't picked up. But I run through those just to show there was a suite of recommendations that we made relating to media, and one of those was the News Media Bargaining Code, which the government did accept. So what we had seen in the course of our study, which caused us to recommend a News Media Bargaining Code, was that Google and Facebook had massive market power. They were using the content of media businesses without paying for it. The media businesses tried to get payment, but they got nowhere. What we found was that Facebook and Google needed news media content on their platform. They desperately did, but they did not need the content of any one media entity. But on the other hand, each media entity needed to be on Google and Facebook for their survival. So Google and Facebook didn't need any particular media entity, so they could say, look, if you don't like our terms, go away. But each media entity needed to be on Google and Facebook. So that led, in our view, to an imbalance in bargaining power. We described that as a market failure, which we felt was important. Obviously, as economists, we can understand there's a lot of market failures in our economies, but this one really mattered because it was a market failure that was having a damaging effect on media, on journalism, and therefore on society, because we certainly were very clear that journalism is fundamental to a well-functioning society. And so that's why this issue had to be addressed. And that was the logic we put forward to address it. And as I say, the government accepted the recommendation. Initially, the government suggested that there be a voluntary code that would attempt to see agreement between Google and Facebook on the one hand and the news media businesses on the other. Behind that was a threat that if the voluntary code didn't work, there might need to be stronger action. The negotiations started in very early January. By March, the government asked for the ACCC's view. How's it going? We gave the view to the government that we did not think these negotiations were going to achieve a financial outcome that we thought was in any way appropriate, that wasn't a topic being much discussed. So in April, the government directed the ACCC to draft a code, a news media bargaining code. So we were given that task. We worked closely with the Department of Communications, the Minister for Communications, which Emma McDonald was then on the staff of, and also the Treasury Department. And we put out a draft code in July. That was for discussion, very much a draft. We put out, on the basis of that discussion, another draft in November. And finally, the legislation was passed in February. As is probably well known, there was a lot of brinkmanship associated with the code getting legislated. Google said that if this code is legislated, they would withdraw search services from Australia. As soon as they did that, the chief executive of Microsoft was talking to our Prime Minister and said, don't worry about losing Google search. Bing can come to your country and provide a wonderful service. So that led to a bit of that didn't play out as Google expected, and they dropped that, essentially back down. Facebook took a different approach. They just took all news off their Facebook site. I just woke up one morning to find that announcement. The problem for Facebook was they overplayed their hand. They not only took down all news, but they took down bushfire warnings when there was actually a bushfire going on in Western Australia. They took down medical warnings when there was a COVID crisis and other medical issues. And so this generated a big backlash against Facebook, people saying, well, we'll get off Facebook if this is the way they're going to treat us. So eventually Facebook backed down as well. But in the course of those threats and that action, that triggered final negotiations between the Treasurer of Australia and the chief executives of Alphabet and Facebook, respectively. A range of changes to the legislation were made before it got passed. Most of them were not of great substance. I guess the one of most importance for us was the government agreed that if Facebook and Google went out and did deals with media businesses, then Facebook and Google would not be designated under the code. So with that, the code legislation was passed. It became law in February of 2021. But the code is law, it sits there, but in a sense, to trigger the provisions I'll describe in a second, Facebook and Google needed to be designated. They didn't want to be designated simply because they didn't want the precedent. They wanted to be able to go to every country, including yours, and say, the code doesn't apply to us, we were never designated. That is a misrepresentation. To avoid designation, they went out and did a lot of deals with media businesses very quickly. So in a sense, the objective of the code was not to have the legislation take effect. It was not to have arbitration, which I'll come to in a second. It was not to see designation. The objective of the code was to get deals done between media businesses and Google and Facebook, and that's what happened. So the objective of the code was completely met. There's three key provisions of the code that matter, a whole lot of them really, but only three really matter. One is that there's provision for negotiation and arbitration. So the parties are required to negotiate. If negotiation doesn't work, there's provision for arbitration. Now, the point of that is that there is a bargaining power imbalance. So just having a requirement to negotiate does not achieve much. But having the ability to go to arbitration, that evens up the bargaining position between the parties, because if you are a monopoly, Google is 95% of search in Australia, you can say, no, I'm not going to negotiate. But, and now we've got a cat joining the scene. But if Google knows that the media businesses have the ability to go to arbitration to get an arbitrated outcome, then Google has every reason to negotiate, and they did. So arbitration was absolutely fundamental. So you have to negotiate, but there is compulsory arbitration. It was also final offer arbitration, where each side puts in their bid to the arbitrator, and the arbitrator selects one bid over the other. The purpose of that is to avoid ambit claims. I mean, if the arbitrator is meant to come up with their own view, then, you know, Google will offer nothing, the media business will ask for something ridiculous, and the arbitrator's left having to basically determine the outcome. We thought there just wasn't the information to do that. So we said final offer arbitration, which would force the parties together. And if somebody came up with a really stupid, outlandish thing, they'd get ignored. And the other, and so this, because neither party would want that to happen, you'd have sensible bids. So negotiate, arbitrate was one characteristic. Secondly, this wasn't a must-carry regime. That is, Google and Facebook were not required to do all this. But if they did a deal with one media business, they had to do a deal with them all. So it's up to them whether they wanted to have any news on Google search or Facebook. But if they did have one, they had to negotiate with everybody, and everybody had the right to go to arbitration in relation to that deal. So fundamental provision, number two. And thirdly, the right to collectively bargain, because there's a whole lot of little players who are too small, even with the ability to go to arbitration, they just don't have the firepower. And so they could get together and collectively bargain. So that's the essential provisions of the code. As I say, what the government conceded in response to Google and Facebook's various threats and actions was that, okay, we won't trigger all that if you go out and do deals. That was the compromise. And the good news from the government's point of view is they did. So the government achieved what it wanted to achieve, which is must never be forgotten. The code has been successful. It got what it wanted to achieve. So in terms of outcomes, over $200 million per year. I think it's well over $200 million per year has been paid each year, every single year, 3, 4, 5-year deals by Google and Facebook combined. Google eventually did deals with essentially all media businesses in Australia that could possibly be eligible. There's a bit of debate about one or two small ones, but basically they did deals with everybody. Facebook did deals with news media businesses that probably employ about 85% of Australian journalists. Maybe it's more than that. It's hard to get good data, but they did a deal with just about everybody, large, medium, and small. I mean, Australia has 4 large media businesses, has, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 medium-sized businesses, and has a large array of small ones. Google did a deal essentially with them all. Facebook did a deal with virtually all. So just to deal with a couple of the criticisms of the code. Some have criticised the code because it doesn't solve all of journalism's problems. My response to that, it was never meant to. It was part of a suite of recommendations to help journalism. We believe there was a need for government grants to go to certain types of journalism. We believe there was a need to keep funding the ABC, Australian Broadcasting Commission, and the SBS, and there are a range of other things. So it was meant to deal with that inability to bargain with Facebook and Google, who were benefiting from journalistic content but not paying for it. That's the only thing it was meant to deal with. Very, very narrow objective, which was achieved. The second criticism, which is one being very much fomented by Google and Facebook, was this only benefited the large players. But that's just factually incorrect. It's just completely wrong. As I say, Google's done a deal with everybody. Facebook's done a deal with large, medium, and small. I guess some of the small players who didn't have a deal with Facebook, and a couple who think they should get a deal with Google but haven't. Controversial as to whether they should or shouldn't. They complain they've been left out, but really large, medium, and small players have got deals. And there's been a number of bits of collective bargaining. Country Press Australia represents the smallest newspapers in the country. I mean, some of these have got 2 or 3 journalists in small country towns. They got together. I mean, they were lucky they had an umbrella organisation to begin with, but they got together and collectively bargained and got a very good deal. Indeed, I would say, in my experience, that the smaller players got considerably more money per journalist employed than the larger players. Certainly Country Press Australia got a very, very good deal. And then the other issue is transparency. People felt that the deal should have been made public. Sorry, some have alleged that the criticism being the deal should have been made public. My view is that's not right. All we're trying to do here, and this is the key point, was even up the bargaining position. So suppose Google didn't have a monopoly and you didn't have this bargaining imbalance, they'd have just done deals anyway. And no one would have known what was in the deal. I mean, companies are doing deals all the time and no one knows what's in them. Yes, this was facilitated by legislation, but just to even up the bargaining power. This is not government decreeing what the outcome is. Where I think the transparency argument has some merit is that the only people who know what the deals are is the ACCC. We know them all because we were in contact with all the media businesses. And so we're the ones, I'm no longer with the ACCC, of course, but we're the ones who know it was considerably more than $200 million. And we know that to be true. I mean, we absolutely have the data, but it's all confidential data, and that probably can be addressed. So just to finish up, the News Media Bargaining Code is being replicated in Canada. Legislation's before the House, the House of Parliament in Canada. It will likely get passed early, middle of the year, 2023. It has one large improvement on the code, which is that, as it were, the governing body, which is actually the media regulator in Canada, will have all the information and publish it in broad terms. So it won't publish deals, but it will publish in aggregate. So it would then, in the Australian context, have given the ACCC the ability to aggregate the data and put it out there in a public way, which is a lot better than getting me along to tell you that it was over $200 million. So I think the Canadian change is an improvement. The United States has legislation for its parliament. We're hoping it gets passed in the lame duck period, but we don't know. So 50-50, they'll pass their legislation. It's very similar to the bargaining code. It has negotiate, arbitrate, it has collective bargaining. What it does is only apply to media below a certain size, because the media above a certain size have already got deals with Facebook and Google. Facebook and Google went out and did those deals once they saw what was happening in Australia. So the big guys got deals. The legislation in the US is for the smaller companies, and let's hope that passes. And then finally in the UK, they are also following the News Media Bargaining Code approach. They're doing it through general legislation, which deals with a whole range of issues, including not just media. But the first thing they'll do when that legislation is passed, hopefully next year, is bring in a News Media Bargaining Code. So there needs to be legislation first, but then that will happen fairly quickly. So I think it's extremely likely the legislation will be a News Media Bargaining Code lookalike will occur in Canada, 50-50 in the US, and actually I'm fairly confident it will happen in the UK as well. So my advice to India is copy the News Media Bargaining Code. The legislation's sitting there. You can also look at the Canada legislation if you want to see another variation of it. It's not much, it's not a big variation. So you've got models there that could be adopted quite quickly rather than having to rethink the whole thing again. So that's all from me. I'm happy to take questions for a while. I'm conscious I'm a couple of minutes over, but very happy to take a couple of questions.
Thank you very much, Rod. Very insightful. You answered a lot of questions, though, and very simplified. I have one question from our publishers of DNPA and publishers in India, which is, our relationship is of divided rivalry with the platforms. We depend on each other. What do you think is a sweet spot in arriving at a happy equilibrium between the two?
I think the only way it can happen is with a legislated arbitration regime. I hope I'm answering your question correctly. You won't get to a sweet spot without some element of compulsion, because the platforms are too dominant. They've got too much market power. So I think if you have the threat of arbitration there, so go negotiate, but the news media businesses have the ability to seek arbitration, then that sweet spot will be found. You won't, in my view, ever have to arbitrate. We never wanted arbitrated deals. We just wanted the threat of arbitration to force people to the bargaining table. So I think you need a negotiate arbitrate regime. My view is you won't need to use it. That sweet spot will be found between the parties. And can I say, the negotiations often took a long time. And this is why it's better that the parties do it rather than the government do it. If the news media businesses are negotiating, each news media business is slightly differently set up and constituted. They had different needs, different things to offer. So the test, and all we were really checking with each news media business was, are you happy with the deal? And all of them said yes. Some of them said, absolutely, they got a very good deal. And some of them said, look, it's a fair deal. We're okay with it. But some of the negotiations took a couple of months of intensive discussion. So leave it to them, but give them the backup of arbitration so that they've got some bargaining power when they sit down with Google and Facebook.
That makes a lot of sense. Tanmay, you want to ask the next question?
Thanks a lot. Continuing, with your, thing that, as you said that, arbitration, is an end goal, but ideally, it is not used. But in India, we see, both, the big tech players offering a lot of, side deals. So they don't want it, to go to that level that, where, we have to, negotiate with them and the, government has to intervene. So how do we really, take care of that? Do we do deals with them and, continue to, work on a path, or, we should, stay away from all the, side deals, which are there on the table right now?
Yeah, good question. So Google and Facebook did side deals with some parties very early. And I might have to shut that up. No, it's been shut up. Excellent. Sorry about that. Google and Facebook did side deals with some companies very early. Those companies that did deals early regret that they did that because they didn't get a very good deal. So I think you can't be sure you're going to get an appropriate deal, an appropriate compensation for your content being used by Google and Facebook, unless you've got that legislated regime sitting in the background. So that when you're negotiating, at the moment, if you're just doing a side deal, you've got no negotiating leverage. But if that legislation's in the background and they know you can go to arbitration, then I think that gives you leverage, which gets a deal that you're comfortable with. Now, it is, to be clear, you know, it's hard to know what an appropriate payment is. All I know is that each of the Australian businesses were happy with the deals. Some did say, well, look, it was hard to know how much to ask for. And that's true, because it's hard to know what the value is. But as I say, the smaller ones got more per journalist than the bigger ones. So I think if there is that threat of arbitration, you really see what's on the table. If there's just side deals without any threats, you won't. And I think you'll get an inferior outcome.
On that note, I also wanted to ask, since you said most of the organizations have got reasonable amount per journalist, do you see an improvement in the quality of journalism, and do you see that sustainable now in Australia? I mean, that was my next question. And is the government happy with that, and the platforms happy with that outcome?
No, look, thank you for that. I did overlook that in my presentation, so thank you for the question. So journalists in Australia have told me and others, and you've got Emma and Peter coming along as well, that there's never been a better time to be a journalist. People teaching journalism say that their journalist students can easily get a job. So there's been a lot of extra recruitment for journalists. The example that's a public one is the Guardian newspaper. It's obviously a British-based newspaper, but it's a digital-only paper in Australia. And it is increasing its staff from 100 to 150, essentially because of the money they got from the News Media Bargaining Code. And they've made that public. The Australian Broadcasting Commission is using all the money for extra journalism as well. It's less clear with other media businesses. And I say that because you don't know whether they were going to, whether they felt they'd be forced to cut journalists, and with the extra money they got, they didn't need to cut. So you don't know what's incremental and what's not. But I think journalism academics and journalists themselves are saying there's never been a better time to be a journalist. So I think you'd say, if the overwhelming view of journalists and news media businesses in Australia is that they're very happy with the outcome. I'd have to put it this way, because the media businesses and the journalists are happy with the outcome, the government's happy with the outcome. Google have, I think, approached it in a very good spirit, and as I say, done deals with everybody. The most recent group, Emma McDonald, put together a collective bargaining group to gather in, as it were, the final group. And so Google, I mean, you'd have to speak to them. They'd rather say they'd obviously rather not have been compelled, but they have, I think, done very well. Facebook have always been reluctant and complaining, so they would say the code's a terrible thing and a terrible outcome. So look, the platforms were, in a sense, forced into this, so you can't expect them to be that happy, but the media businesses, journalism, government, extremely happy.
Okay, we would also like to take a question from our audience. So, Rohel, you would like to ask that?
Yeah. There's a question. I couldn't read the name of this person, is not clear, but they want to say that what are the big learnings for Indian media from whatever is happening on the global front? Briefly, though you have answered it, but specifically, if you could maybe sum it up for them.
I think the lessons are that we have social media now. It is a dominant presence, but social media, Google, Facebook, others, and obviously Apple News is now growing. They don't produce journalism. They're not producing journalistic content. They need journalistic content. Society needs journalistic content. So we have to find a way of getting money for journalism and media businesses from the social media. And I think the News Media Bargaining Code is a great way to do that. It's not the only thing governments need to do. I think the governments probably do need to support certain types of journalism. And there's other things in our recommendations, but I think working out a way forward with the big digital platforms is absolutely fundamental. And I think the News Media Bargaining Code does that very well.
Thank you, Professor Sims. And I could, intently, I was listening to what you said, and the fact that this is the great time to be a journalist is good for the government, for the journalists. I mean, that was profound. I hope it's the return of journalism. But thank you, gentlemen, for this wonderful conversation. And I would like to move and introduce
one more question, Rohel.
Yeah, okay. All right. I'm so sorry. Yes.
There's one more question from our DNPA.
All right.
The question is, what about the future? Today we have 2, 3, we have a Facebook, we have Google. Tomorrow we have more platforms emerging. And of course, we had TikTok, which is not there in our country. But how's the future looking like, and what should we do for holding the future that we live for the next 10, 20 years?
So the legislation allows the government, so legislation is the law in Australia. It has no sunset, it's just there. It has been reviewed by Treasury, and they might make changes to it, but they'd only be proposing changes, which Parliament may have to accept. But the legislation's there. The legislation allows the Treasurer of Australia, or the Finance Minister, I guess, in an Indian context, to designate appropriate platforms. And the idea was Google and Facebook, when we did the work a couple of years ago, Apple News may be a candidate, TikTok may be a candidate. So the legislation is open to designating other platforms. So it's very flexible in that sense. I should add that the legislation was supported by all the 3 major political parties in Australia and all the independents. So everybody supported it. That's no great surprise, since all the media supported it. And that's one thing I think is really crucial. Media needs to talk as one and get behind something like this. In my country, in Australia, if all the media support something, it usually gets support from the government. And that's what we had: support from the government, support from the opposition, support from the Greens, support from the independents. So it has a lot of support. Now, when these deals run out in 3, 4 years, 5 years time, obviously we'll then see what's happening. Facebook is trying to downgrade news on its platform, so that will be interesting. So I just think we need to rethink in a few years' time which platform should be covered. But the framework of the law sits there. That's the crucial thing. The legislation is there. Whether or not somebody's designated, they better do deals, otherwise they will be. So I think the crucial step is getting the law passed. Then it's the law of India, and it is there, and it will protect journalism going into the future, as I'm hoping that the News Media Bargaining Code will in Australia.